All right, that was fun, huh? So we've looked at the physics, we've looked at the chemistry, we've looked at the metallurgy, we've looked at the industrial side of things. I want to look at a side of this that I feel often gets kind of overlooked, though these days it's been a topic of more excitement and importance. And it's almost in some ways you can think of it as the electrical side of things, which you might think, oh my gosh, that is really getting pedantic. And we're going to look at the electrical engineering of nuclear weapons. But the electrical stuff is where the control systems come in. And there are lots of really complicated things and interesting questions that come up when you start thinking about how do you actually want these things to launch or not launch, as the case may be. So this is on a command and control, and I've, in academic form, labeled this a brief primer, which is a little redundant, but I want to emphasize this is like a massive topic. And it's massive, not just like we could spend all day doing this, but there's technical aspects of it that I don't know the answer to. There's a lot of this that is still classified. We have a lot of historical information. There's a lot of this that you could ask about other countries, where sometimes we have ideas of what the answers are, and sometimes we don't. So I'm just giving myself a total, excuse for not covering everything by doing this. So yeah, nuclear command and control. What do we mean by nuclear? Oh, you know what? This is not. Oh, it's fine. Nuclear command and control. The basic tenets of it are typically something like this. Number one, if you have nuclear weapons, they will be used when they are authorized. This is sort of like axiom number one of nuclear command and control. If you want to launch a nuke and you can't do it, you've messed up deterrence, you've messed up the strategic point of it. Fine, sounds safe? Okay, number two, they won't be used when they're not authorized. You do not want your nuclear weapons to accidentally get launched. You do not want them to accidentally go off. You do not want anything to happen that is not sort of within your parameters of authorization. And I render this in a very generic sort of term. We'll get into what we might mean by authorization and things like that. But you don't want some random member of your military saying, hey, let's start nuclear war. You don't want a Dr. Strangelove situation. You can think of Dr. Strangelove as a movie about command and control. So this sounds like pretty nice. This is phrased in the American literature as the so-called always never problem. You always want them to work when you want them to work, and you never want them to work when they're not supposed to work. And this sounds pretty straightforward, but in practice it's actually very hard to do both of these things at the same time. And I would just emphasize, as a historian of science and technology, it's very rare for anything to work. It's basically impossible for anything to work 100% of the time. And it's impossible for something to not go wrong, to keep things from going wrong 100% of the time. So this is very tricky, and this involves immensely complicated technical systems and immensely complicated organizational systems and sometimes legal systems. This is where all this kind of stuff comes together in a really fun, nasty way. So this is why this is important. What do we mean by authority here? These are questions like, who gets to authorize the use of nuclear weapons? Whose decision? If we're going to go to nuclear war, if we're going to use a nuclear weapon, who matters? And I'll just, spoiler. In the United States, it's the United States president, but in other countries, it's set up differently. Like there's no inherent answer to what this has to be. At the beginning of the Cold War, the end of World War II, they didn't know what the answer was. You can come up with a lot of possible good answers to this question, and different countries have evolved these systems differently. And in the American case, which is a lot of what I study, it's been a really contentious back and forth over what exactly the answers to this should be. One question that comes up a lot, especially in the early Cold War, in the United States, this has basically been settled to a degree, but it's very complex, but is not settled in all countries. I'm just going to move this microphone. Who is going to be in actual control of the weapons? Civilians, the civilian government, the political class, or the military, the people who are usually in charge of weapons? To what degree are these differentiations enforced by technological barriers? To what degree are they just like regulations? To what degree are they things like institutional norms, right? People know not to hit the button, right? I mean, these are real questions, and they've changed over time as well. Is the decision to use a nuclear weapon unilateral? Is it one person or sometimes even one country? If you think of a complex organization like NATO, does the United States get to speak for all of NATO, or do the NATO countries get a vote? Is it a unilateral sort of decision, or is it multilateral? Does the person who gets to decide have to get a couple other people on board before they turn the switch? These are, again, issues that keep coming up. You get into a whole lot of detail on like, okay, say we want to make sure that we always want to use this, it won't get used accidentally. How do you know this is going to work? How do you know this is going to work in a time of war? If you say the president gets to make the decision, what happens if the president gets killed first? Who then gets to make the second decision? These are some of the other areas under which this authority question has devolved. And it's not coincidental that some of these authority questions get figured out periodically because something like this happens. A lot of questions about nuclear authority and succession happened after the Kennedy assassination. Because people realized, hey, we don't have a protocol for this with our nuclear weapons, and what if that had been a Soviet thing, and then they launched a bunch of weapons, and then we're scrambling to figure out who's in charge, et cetera, et cetera. So they changed procedures. And decapitation just means, killing off the political or military head. So if you hit the Pentagon, is there a system that will say, fine, we don't need the Pentagon to reply? If you really believe strongly in deterrence theory, you need to have these things in your system or else it becomes not credible. If you're a strategist, you worry about your enemy thinking, if I just kill that guy off, then they're defenseless, and then I launch the big attack. So you might have like a little thing and then a big one. And lastly, and I mentioned this a little bit, for any of these decisions you make, how is it made real in the world? Is it just a legal thing where you say no one is authorized to do this, and if they do, they might go to jail? Which, we do that for a lot of things in our government. For nuclear war, that might not be sufficient, right? Like if you're going to start global thermonuclear war, the threat of jail may not seem, or even a really big fine, right? Like may not be sufficient or proportional to the consequences. So over the years, there have been various kinds, even from the very beginning, interestingly, of technical ways of reinforcing this. If you really don't trust the military, which was the case in the early Cold War with civilian political officials, you might not give them the nuclear weapons. They can't use nuclear weapons they don't have. That changes over the course of the Cold War, but this is even very basic physical barriers. You keep part of the weapon kept in a different bunker, armed by, guarded by different people. That's one way to do technical. Today, they use very highly technical systems to make sure that even if you stole a nuclear weapon in the United States, you're not going to be able to do that much with it because it's got safety and security features built into the weapon itself. When I mention technical organizational dimensions, and this is the part that makes me sound like a super academic because I'm like putting hyphens into things, you're just lucky I didn't use the word socio-technical, because that is, if we had my other colleagues here from other parts of this campus, they'd be like, these are socio-technical systems, or we're not going to get into that here. I want to just emphasize that there isn't a technical solution to this, and there isn't an organizational solution to this. There are only solutions that involve both of these things, and this makes this an immensely complicated problem with a lot of places where things will go wrong. How do you guarantee that authority? This is not just a technical question. It's not just having a lock on there. If you're going to have a lock on your bomb, you have to have an elaborate system of who sets the combination. How do you update that if you need to? What happens if you lose one of the things? If these things happen in the real world. How do you make sure the guy who needs, or gal, as it turns out, who needs the combination will have it at the time they need it, especially in a time of immense crisis like nuclear war, right? This isn't something that necessarily just functions in happy times. So that's one question that comes up. How do you avoid misuse? How do you make sure that nothing goes totally wrong? How do you enforce that? Hard questions. How are use orders propagated? Let's say I do want to be able to use a nuclear weapon. How does that work in practice? You don't want this to be a willy-nilly thing, especially in later periods of the Cold War or the present day, where the time of response is very short. In the early Cold War, it took weeks to deploy a nuclear weapon. It was not something that could happen in a minute. After the Soviet Union got the bomb, people started saying that sounds like too much time. We might want to be able to do something faster. Once you get missiles, you have 20 minutes at most to reply. In some situations, you can imagine having only minutes or seconds to reply. How do you actually make sure the system functions under those? That's not an easy question. And again, it's not just technical, it's organizational as well. How do you survive an enemy attack? How does your command and control system, all these, you can think of even just phone lines, but satellites, whatever, radar, how do they survive not being destroyed themselves? Because if you have a big system that is essential for you to respond, that's of course exactly what the enemy is going to target first, right? I would do that. So, how does that happen? And here's a really tricky one. If there are conflicts between the always and never components, which wins? So for example, you can make a nuclear weapon that's very hard to go off accidentally. And all of our nuclear weapons now have little sensors in them so that if it's on a missile and it has not achieved the right speed, it assumes it has not been launched correctly and it will not arm the missile, right? That's a very smart thing to add on there. You can put it's not a very hard sensor to do. It just means that if it doesn't accelerate fast enough, some switch isn't going to close and it's like, I fell out of a plane, I didn't actually launch, don't go. It's what's called an environmental sensor. Great. What are the odds of that sensor failing and not arming the missile in actual practice? Non-zero. Right? So are you going to preference the idea that this weapon won't go off accidentally, or are you going to preference the idea that it goes off when it does? There's a really tricky balance between these two things. It's a real engineering problem. And again, historically, sometimes the military and the civilian Department of Energy type scientists, Los Alamos people, mostly Sandia actually, where a lot of the safety stuff happens, have tried to argue like we should preference the always, and sometimes they've said like, no, let's preference the never. I think it's better that these things don't go off accidentally than the possibility that some of them won't work as intended if nuclear war happens. There's no technical answer to that question. That's a question of values. Oh, okay. So how does it work in the United States now? If you look up doctrine on this, you'll see this kind of totemic phrase repeated over and over again, and I just want to like put it out there. Like this is how the military and even the political system talks about this in what we have of their doctrine. Something like this: only the President of the United States can authorize the employment of U.S. nuclear weapons. Right? So it sounds more or less straightforward. So we have apologies for the clip art. We have a president. This is just a generic president, and we have a bomb, generic bomb. It's all right to have a little fun, as long as you don't have too much fun. As one of my advisors told me. In some way, we're describing a system that looks like this: President wants a bomb to be dropped. Bomb is dropped. I put a big arrow there. There is so much complexity in that arrow. There are so many interesting questions in that arrow. Does it have to go through a Secretary of Defense? Does it go into a computer? Is there a button on his desk he can push and then the thing just happens instantly? Can he tweet it out? Can he go Stratcom go, right? Like what goes into that arrow is the question of command and control. Also, the statement above that says we think that one person, the president, is the only one who can authorize this, that's part of command and control too. So all of this is command and control. Even the actual dropping of it, which might be a plane, if it's an actual dropping, it might be missile commanders in a silo flipping a switch, it might be people in a submarine, it depends on whatever situation. That's part of command and control too. This whole problem is command and control. And all of its technical, political, sociological problems. Isn't this fun? So how does this work in practice? There's not that much doctrine that tells you exactly how this works in practice because for sort of sensible reason that if this was totally outlined and totally transparent and totally straightforward, it would be really useful to like the Russians, right? It'd be really useful to somebody who wanted to say, this is the crucial node in the system. I take that node out and nothing functions, haha. And there may be, I'm a little dubious that we have nodes like that in the system because we've designed the systems mostly to avoid that kind of problem, but it's possible, Our military systems are sometimes concentrated around certain nodes in really interesting ways. I'm on a dissertation committee for a student who is in the Army and he's analyzing military systems and how they connect. And you know what military system is at the heart of every other military system? Like it's in everything. If you took it out, like I don't know what would happen. GPS, good job. Good job. Yes, GPS. It's actually stunning how many systems in the modern military depend on GPS. And I'm not saying if you took out GPS, none of these things would work. I'm sure the weapon systems, I hope, are designed so that that isn't the case. And it's not the easiest thing in the world to take out GPS at this point, but like, anyway.
It's a separate military GPS system.
Yeah, but again, it's satellites. We can shoot on satellites, right? I mean, you could imagine jamming. I don't know. I'm not a mastermind, but like my point is that like presumably they've built these things so that GPS isn't mandatory. But anyways, so this is a rare thing I stumbled across. It's actual Air Force doctrine declassified on nuclear operations. It's pretty recent, May 2015. This isn't like ancient history, 1970 stuff. And I will just also say there's a lot of uncertainty in what we can know about this. People will often point to, well, this doctrine said that. Well, that doctrine is from the 70s. Is that still viable? I don't know. It's actually very hard to know because None of this is codified in the law, I should say. None of it, including the idea that the president is the only person. That is not actually codified in law. There are some things codified in law, like the civilians produce the weapons and then they get transferred to the military at some point and the president has to approve that. That's codified in law. But the actual, like, how do you use a nuclear weapon, who gets to do it, there's no law that covers this whatsoever. It's all done by regulation. A lot of it is secret regulation. What that means is they can change it, and they do change it periodically. So one of my projects that I'm working on right now is trying to take all the public domain stuff we have on this and tag it by date and then put it into one big database. It's going to be a really cool website, presidentandthebomb.com, to help sort of make sense of these things, because people will always go and, well, I found this one document that applied this. Great, good to know. Let's add it to the pile of like data and see where it contradicts. And one of the hard things is a lot of people point to things that are very old. Or they point to something that points to something that points to something, and you trace it down, and oh, this is a DoD regulation from the 50s. I don't know if that's true anymore, right? They've changed it many times since then. So anyway, whenever I can find something that's like reasonably current, that's useful.
But is it your sense that the system, in fact, is clear and we can't get access to it, or the system might be as fucked up as our ability to see it?
That's a really nice epistemological question. There are indications in both directions. I suspect there is more in the latter category, that the system is not clear on many of these issues. What is my evidence for this, you might ask? We've had some congressional testimony recently from various generals and people who have worked in the system, and they sometimes have very frank responses when they get asked specific questions, like what would happen if the president wanted you to do something crazy and then you disagree? And like, this is one of the generals recently who was like, that would be a very interesting constitutional situation. Like, okay, that's a really disturbing answer, right? That means we don't have a guidebook for this. We haven't gamed this out. Now, we know that there are some things they have gamed out. So if it's in the category of like, Russia attacks us, like they've got a playbook for that. They've got a lot of playbooks that are ready to go, attack plans that have all been vetted, that are all gone through all the lawyers. Good, great, right? But there's a lot of world out there and questions that I don't think they have as kind of. But again, I'm on the outside. I have no clearance. This is why I can say anything I want. I've never had a clearance. I don't want a clearance, right? So take what I say with as many grains of salt as you feel appropriate. I've had some people say to me, you know, like, well, I knew differently. I've talked to a guy who's talked to a guy. I'm like, all right, whatever, I need evidence. I'm an academic, but like, you know, I do my best, but there's a lot of unknowns here. I want to acknowledge that. So anyway, here's a nice passage from this Air Force doctrine. The emphasis is in the original, the boldness. The employment of nuclear weapons at any level requires explicit orders from the president. The nature of nuclear weapons, overwhelmingly more significant than conventional weapons, is such that their use can produce political and psychological effects well beyond their actual physical effects. True. And then ... The decision whether or not to use nuclear weapons will always be a political decision and not a military one. And I just point this out that this is a very modern day, late Cold War kind of sentiment. You find this repeated. I believe them when they say this, that this is how the military views this. They don't want the responsibility of using this weapon. That isn't how they started the Cold War, as an aside. But the modern military has really adopted this culture that, like, this is not our decision. You tell us to do it, we'll do it. But this is a political decision. Our hands are clean of making that choice. So that's a useful sort of, speaking of socio-technical, that's a sort of cultural thing. And again, it doesn't have to be that way. It wasn't that way in the 50s and 60s. It's a much more fraught question.
The president is the only one who has authority, but are there other people who know physically how to do it?
We will cover this in the next 2 slides. Yes, good question. Here's another bit from the same piece that I also like. How does it actually work? Very rare to find a paragraph that describes this. Here's what it says. And again, we don't have to necessarily believe the whole thing, but the president may direct the use of nuclear weapons through an execute order, that sounds official, via the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the combatant commanders and ultimately to the forces in the field exercising direct control of weapons. So that's about as bold as I've ever seen of a statement of how this actually works. There are ways in which I have doubts that not 100% of this is correct, but yeah.
So the operative word there is may?
May.
The verb.
Yeah.
May.
It's not a will, but it's a may.
And not must.
Well, they don't have to.
It can happen this way.
Oh, yes, exactly. That's a good point. And this is actually a point I was about to make. I think there are probably multiple ways for this to happen. I suspect this is one of the ways. There's another way that also seems to be out there, but yes, exactly. I have talked to people who are actual missileers and have said that, you know, in theory, the president could like call you up directly and read you the right numbers and then, you know, do it that way. That's like the least efficient way you could imagine doing it. But I think there's nothing regulation-wise that prohibits that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. So there's probably other pathways to this.
Well, what do you mean?
What do you mean?
I mean, this doesn't say whether it's by phone or by fax or.
Yeah,
Or by tweet.
Or tweet. I will cover this in just one second. Let me just clarify it in the next slide. So how do we imagine this order propagates? How do we fill in the arrow? We remove the arrow. If we follow this to a T, it looks something like this. The president decides, for whatever reason, that he wants a bomb to go off, right? Next, according to this thing, it goes to the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is not necessarily a person. I mean, it is a person, but it could be an organization. It could be routing it through the chairman, the office of the chairman. There's also reasons to think that Stratcom, the strategic command, it may be the other, at least one other way in which this happens. When the Stratcom generals testify, they make it sound like the president is calling them. Is that the case? Is that one of possible cases? I don't know. It seems totally plausible to me that it could be both of these could be true, or the doctrine could be vague. I don't know. But for me, what's important here is you're immediately bridging from a political voice to a military. This is a guy in a uniform. There is, by the way, no Secretary of Defense in this. This is one of the persistent things that you find on the internet, like, oh, the Secretary of Defense has to agree, the Secretary of Defense. That doesn't seem to be true. And I don't just mean that because I've seen some documents which imply not true. I've asked at least one Secretary of Defense, is this true? And they have said, our role is advisory. We're supposed to, they should talk to us and we should give them very good advice. And we should tell them not to do it.
In 20 minutes or less.
In 20 minutes or less. Or, yeah, emphasis on the less, probably, right? But they don't have to listen to our advice. The Secretary of Defense is not a veto. They're not even in the necessary chain of command for this particular thing. The President can probably call up Stratcom directly. You know, I get a little worried when Mattis goes out of town. But like, you know, you don't need them in there. And this is, I think, you know, whether you think that's a problem or not, this is what everything I have found is pointed to, even though you'll find a lot of times repeated, Secretary of Defense has to authenticate, Secretary of Defense could agree not to do that. It doesn't actually seem, the Secretary of Defense does not seem actually necessary.
What's the problem that's solving? How did we get to a point where it was like that, given that it's basically every other circumstance in which
Yes.
it's reversed. The Secretary of Defense is in the chain of command, the CJCS isn't.
We'll cover a little of the history in a second, but the idea here is, again, this authority thing. If you give the Secretary of Defense a veto, does that mean the Secretary of Defense has some kind of authority? Does that mean they're also an unelected official? How does that play into things? And we'll talk about why these norms got set up. The problem they are trying to solve when they set up the system is not how do we keep the president from doing a really bad thing. The problem they are trying to solve is how do we rapidly deploy nuclear forces in the event of a first strike, and how do we keep the military from running like rampant and doing things on their own agenda. That is not necessarily the problem we have today, but that's the problem under which this system evolved. So all right, they agree to this for some reason or another. There is, by the way, the general who runs Stratcom has said, we don't just like slavishly do what the president tells us. We have, we are still beholden to rule of law. There are, you know, regulations as to what you're allowed to do through treaties and international regulations. We have a bunch of lawyers. There'd be a discussion. Sometimes people have said, oh, that sounds fine. And like, I just want to point out that's only a very narrow definition of like saying no. That saying no if this is explicitly illegal and under the Stratcom lawyers' interpretation of the rules of law, which I will just say, the United States has reaffirmed many times that the use of nuclear weapons by itself is not a war crime. It's about, you know, proportionality and these other things, but they've made it clear that like, we have plans to eradicate whole countries, whole nations, right? So like, if you're thinking that like, well, the sheer awfulness of this would keep anybody from doing it, I don't think that's how Stratcom thinks. But it might prevent you from what they, you know, what they call, this technical term, the crazy president situation, of the president saying like, destroy Liechtenstein, they really annoyed me, right? It might get you like totally irrational. I just want to start, I want to watch everything burn, sure. But there's a lot of subtle situations that are in there that are still like terrible ideas that would probably fit pretty well into this. What do they do? I black boxed this because this is where all the complexity is. These are the C3 systems. These are, and I'll show you a picture of what these are in a minute, but satellites, communications means of communicating with submarines who are underwater, airplanes with massive antennas out the back of them so that you can communicate in the air with submarines out the water, etc. There's an immense, again, socio-technical system, technical and organizational system that is meant to convey these orders. And I tend to black box this in part, even though historians of technology don't like to do that, but there's a lot of complexity here that I think you get bogged down into. The point is this system, once that order goes into it, is meant to transmit those orders. It is not full of people who are going to sit there and say, is this order a good idea? If you're wondering about who might resist, it's not, once it gets past, I think, this particular person on the left here, that order is going out. It's going to be executed. The system is built to execute orders. So it passes things on to the launch officers. If you think launch officers are going to disobey an order to launch, you misunderstand how they train them and pick them. I'm not saying they're bad people, but they're not meant to be loose parts of this system. They're not meant to exercise human judgment on this level. They're meant to exercise human judgment on the level of have I got all the right information? There is a little role for judgment in this. This is why it is not fully automated. There is no button you can push and magically have things happen. They're very responsible people. I have nothing against them, but don't expect them to be the stopgap if an order goes through, and then they tell the bomb, please launch, and the bomb launches. So this is a very simplified form. Fun. Okay, we'll keep on. I'm going to come back to these thorny questions and the Q&A. How does this happen? I'm just going to highlight just a couple little systems here for just an idea. We've heard of the nuclear football, probably. If not, congratulations, you learned anything today. Nuclear football is these satchels that are being carried by this burly man. This is always following the president. It's kind of a fun game of people who are like nuclear wonks to spot the football. Because you're not really supposed to have lots of pictures of the football, but take pictures. AP takes pictures of the president, and there's a guy behind him with the football, and you can tell it's him because nobody else would carry that much in just one package. That is the means by which remotely the president can authorize nuclear launch orders. What's exactly in there, I think, has changed over the years, but it contains, the means of forming a valid order, the means of confirming the president's identity. So if the president is the person doing it, you have to have somebody say it is indeed the president who made this order. This is where you get these things like the nuclear codes. Nuclear codes are not a password. They are just a way of confirming that the president is the president, and in theory, only the president should have it. This guy can confirm them. The Secretary of Defense can confirm them. There's probably people even at Stratcom. There's also probably some means of connecting, if you were somehow away from a phone, a global telephone or something like that, with these Strategic Command or the Pentagon or whoever. So this is the famous football. I think it's a little less interesting than it's made out to be. I like this guy's shoes better. Okay, this is what I black boxed. This is how the military depicts and the Department of Defense depicts command and control. And as you can see, it's a lot of complicated stuff overlapping. Political control in the White House, sort of military political control in the Pentagon, the sensors, all these radars. They would also put early warning in as part of their command and control. They also think a lot about making sure everybody can talk to each other if they want to. They want the president to be able to talk to anybody at any time about these issues. You have all this stuff for moving around, including really old phones. And then you have the shooters. I love the term shooters. These are the means of actually delivering weapons, and in this case it's submarines and bombers and missiles and things like that. And these are all linked together in command and control. I just want to also point out that any system that is extremely complex, and especially technical systems, especially technical plus human systems, there is always a real chance of error. We got a nice example of this a few months ago with the Hawaii early warning thing, and I don't want to be mean to the people of Hawaii on this. Any system is going to have some chance of error. If you have an immensely complicated system with immensely numbers of places for error to be introduced, both technical and human, you will get a dribble of errors over time. We could spend the entire time here talking about who has the funniest nuclear error story. I'll tell you mine just for one. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, height of tensions at one of the airfield bases, a guard saw what he thought was a Soviet Spetsnaz saboteur trying to break into the facility. It was a bear. He hit the intruder alarm. Already we have one error, right? Human error, bear equals Soviet, close enough, right? that alarm turned out to be wired incorrectly, so at a nearby airbase, and instead of doing the facility breached alarm, it did the we're under attack alarm, and so they scrambled all these jet fighters with nuclear like missiles on them to shoot, and you know, it was fine, they didn't go to war, whew. But like, this is the kind of thing where there's been a lot of sociological study of accidents and disasters, and the answer is like they happen way more often than people realize they do. And sometimes they happen during times of crisis, and sometimes they don't. And there's also things where the phrase, nobody could have guessed that problem number one would have happened at the same time as problem number two, like that happens really more often. And the issue is not that these two problems are very likely, but that there are a million possible problems at any given time. Eventually, it goes down to the missile people. They read codes, they do things. There's a whole set of how that works. In the missile, no one person can start the bomb. You have a two-man rule. So you need two people to, within a certain time phrase, you know, put in the keys at the right time and turn the switches at the right time. In most of our system, we have this kind of redundancy. This is one way to keep things from being abused. And again, the only place we really don't have that redundancy is in the initial decision to launch. That's literally one human being. And the weapons themselves have technical stuff on them to keep them from being modified or taken. So the top is the kind of thing you have to put in to make the missile work, and you have to look up the codes from the safe. The bottom is what's called a PAL, Permissive Action Link. This is a complicated sort of computer that's inside the weapon. And if you don't have the right sort of code to unlock the weapon, you can't use the weapon. And those are very, you know, nice and important. We started putting those in there when we started worrying about people, say, stealing our weapons and, you know, suddenly becoming nuclear. This makes it much harder, maybe not impossible, but like really hard. You kind of have to redesign the whole weapon. You might be able to get the fuel out. Some of them apparently fail in a way that just breaks the weapon if you put in the wrong code too many times, things like that. And again, you can see the tension between the always never. Do you want your weapon to break if you put the code in wrong 3 times? How many people have gotten their password wrong 3 times, even though they've like are pretty sure they typed it in right? There's a tension there. You don't want to have it be an infinite number of retries, but you also don't want it to be too easy. So what do we have today in the United States? This is just a recap of some of the, I think of these as like the essential beliefs, and then we'll this is it, I think. We can talk about the history if you want later. We have civilian control of the weapons. They are meant to have the authority to use, but we have military ownership of the weapons. All the weapons essentially are in the hands of the military. And again, that wasn't always the case. In the early Cold War, all the weapons, under Truman, all but 9 nuclear weapons were in the hands of civilians at all times. Under Eisenhower, it switched so that over 90% of them were in the hands of the military. There's an interesting technical reason for that, bureaucratic reasons, strategic reasons, et cetera, but this is where we are. We have unilateral launch authority invested in the US president. That authority is enforced both with technical systems and regulations, and again, the regulations are often secret. We have really highly technical means of moving orders through the systems. We have an emphasis on speed, not deliberation. There is some place for deliberation, but it's meant to happen fast. And there is no way on the books that I have ever heard of for anybody in that system to legally veto the order. There are tricky questions about practicality. Could you like tackle the guy with the football? Could you ignore the president? Could you just refuse? Sure, fine. But that is essentially the system not functioning as intended. It's possible. And lastly, we usually, on safety and security issues, we've really emphasized the never. We're very good at like not worrying about our weapons getting stolen, but on the authority to use, we emphasize the always. And it's a nice open question about like whether that's where we are today. Okay, I'm done.